There's a moment, just before the dawn breaks, when the world holds its breath. A hush so delicate you can almost feel the earth itself waiting. And in that moment, there's only now. But how often do we notice it? How often do we truly taste the cool morning air on our lips, feel the warmth of sunlight on our skin, or hear the quiet music of leaves dancing in the wind? Most of us, we miss it. We live surrounded by distractions. 1,000 tiny voices tugging at the edges of our awareness. Deadlines, notifications, worries, memories, fears. Always looking back or reaching ahead. We chase a past we can no longer touch, haunted by things we wish we'd done differently. Or we run toward a future we can't control, clinging to hopes of a happiness we imagine will arrive someday, somewhere, somehow. And in doing so, we abandon the only place life actually exists, this moment, right here, right now. The great Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh once wrote, "The present moment is filled with joy and happiness. If you are attentive, you will see it." But why do we find it so hard to be present? Why is it that our minds seem wired to live anywhere but here? It's because the mind is a restless traveler. It wanders endlessly between memories and fantasies, regrets and projections. It builds stories about what was and what might be while ignoring what is. And yet this moment, this breath you're taking, is the only certainty you have. Everything else is a story. Imagine this: a child laughing in a sun-drenched field, a bird taking flight, the scent of rain on dry earth. In those fleeting fragments of life, there is a quiet miracle unfolding. But too often, we're too busy to notice. We think we're living when we're merely surviving. We pour our attention into things that won't matter in a week, a month, or a year. We scroll through endless news feeds, worrying about problems half a world away, while the most sacred thing we possess slips quietly through our fingers, our awareness of this living, breathing moment. The Buddha taught that clinging to the past brings sorrow, craving for the future brings anxiety. But peace lives only here. It's not found in a future promotion. It's not in a vacation 3 months from now. It's not buried in the pages of history. It's in the warmth of this breath, the rise and fall of your chest, the sound of your heartbeat, steady, ancient, enduring. And perhaps the tragedy of modern life is that we have forgotten how to be alive. We confuse movement with progress. We mistake distraction for living. We've traded our sacred stillness for constant noise. But you, right now, have a choice. You can pause, close your eyes, listen to the world as it truly is. Feel your presence in this moment. Because this moment, however ordinary it may seem, is extraordinary. And if you're truly awake to it, you'll discover a truth so simple, yet so overlooked. You don't have to chase happiness. It's already here. The Japanese poet Basho once wrote, "Every day is a journey, and the journey itself is home." Not tomorrow, not when you have more money, more time, or more love. Now, this breath, this awareness. And so, before we move any further, let's begin. Not by doing more, but by simply being here, fully, deeply, unapologetically alive, because life is not something waiting for you after the next achievement. It's not hiding in the pages of tomorrow. It's here, and if you listen closely, you can feel it. And from here, something beautiful begins to unfold. It's strange, isn't it? We live our lives as though time were a straight line, a past we've left behind, a future racing toward us, and a fleeting present moment barely noticeable before it's gone. But what if I told you that time as you know it is an illusion? For centuries, sages and philosophers have whispered this truth. That past and future are ideas, constructs born from the restless human mind. And though we fill our days with plans, schedules, memories, and regrets, none of those things truly exist. Not here, not now. Think about it. When you recall a memory, where does it exist? Not in some tangible place you can visit. It exists only in your mind, a flicker of thought, a story you tell yourself, and when you imagine tomorrow. That too is a projection, a movie played inside your head, a guess at what might be but never guaranteed. And yet we spend most of our lives trapped between these two phantoms, haunted by yesterday, obsessed with tomorrow, rarely awake to the miracle of now. Soft, melancholic melody begins. The Buddha called this samsara, the endless cycle of suffering caused by attachment. And at the root of it all is our attachment to time. We mourn our past mistakes, unable to let go. We long for lost loves, chasing shadows. We craft endless futures in our heads, hoping for salvation just around the corner. But the truth is, you are not your past. You are not your future. You are this breath, this awareness, this unnameable presence, eternal, boundless, untouched by the clock. The mind, however, loves to trap us. It tells us stories. It whispers, once you have this, then you'll be happy. Once you fix that, then you'll be free. But freedom isn't found by rearranging the future. Freedom is found by realizing the future isn't real. Have you ever noticed, when you're completely absorbed in something, watching the ocean, holding a newborn, losing yourself in a piece of music, time vanishes? There's no past, no future, only pure, raw, unfiltered being. That is your natural state, unchained by the illusion of time, unburdened by memory or expectation. The masters of old understood this. They knew that enlightenment wasn't some distant achievement waiting in the years ahead. It was a return, a remembering of what you truly are, of what's always been here. When the great Zen master Dogen was asked about the nature of time, he smiled and said, "Time itself is being, and all being is time." Meaning, the present moment is not a fleeting second between past and future. It is eternity itself. And when you fully inhabit this moment, you step outside of time. You become timeless. And perhaps this is what we've been running from. Not the weight of the past, not the uncertainty of tomorrow, but the terrifying, beautiful truth that all we ever have is now. And that's enough, because in this moment, there is no pain from the past. There is no anxiety for the future. There is only presence, and presence is peace. So the next time your mind pulls you into old stories, the next time it seduces you with promises of a better someday, pause, feel the weight of your body, the texture of the air, the steady rhythm of your breath, and remember, the past is a dream, the future is a dream, you are the dreamer, and when the dreamer awakens, the illusion dissolves, and only life remains. And so, as the illusion of time begins to loosen its grip, we arrive at a doorway, a silent invitation to step back into the only place we've ever truly existed, this moment. But how do we return? How do we reclaim the scattered fragments of our attention, lost in yesterday's regrets and tomorrow's promises? The answer is awareness, not the hurried awareness of ordinary life, where we notice just enough to navigate through traffic, through emails, through small talk, but a deeper, quieter kind of awareness, one that listens without judging, sees without labeling, and feels without clinging. The Buddha called it sati, mindfulness, and it's not some mystical technique reserved for monks on mountaintops. It's a simple, radical act of being fully where you are, here, now. Mindfulness is not about changing the world around you. It's about changing the way you meet the world. It's the art of noticing the way sunlight rests on the surface of your tea, the sound of a distant bird you'd normally ignore, the way your chest rises and falls with every breath, a quiet miracle you've long since stopped appreciating. It's the courage to pause, to feel the tension in your shoulders and soften it, to taste your food instead of devouring it, to hear the voice of a loved one, not just as background noise, but as a presence you cherish. And when you truly pay attention, something astonishing happens. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. The mundane reveals its hidden grace, a droplet of rain on your skin, the scent of the earth after a storm, the simple pleasure of sitting, breathing, existing. This is the art of mindful awareness, noticing without naming, experiencing without clinging, witnessing without interfering. Many of us live like ghosts in our own lives, half here, half somewhere else. Our bodies present, but our minds chasing old stories or future fears. But the masters knew the key to awakening isn't in running from the mind. It's in gently, lovingly returning, over and over again. Like training a wild horse, Patiently, kindly, with a soft hand, you might ask, how do I practice this? It begins simply. When you eat, just eat. Feel the texture, the warmth, the flavors dancing on your tongue. When you walk, just walk. Notice the ground beneath your feet, the swing of your arms, the sky above you. When you listen, truly listen, not waiting for your turn to speak, but receiving each word as if it were a precious gift. And most of all, when you breathe, just breathe. Feel the coolness of the inhale, the warmth of the exhale, the gentle rhythm of life moving through you. In those moments, the mind may pull you away, and that's okay. Because the practice is not perfection. The practice is in the returning, again and again and again. Each time you come back, you reclaim a piece of yourself. Each time you come back, you step out of the illusion and into what is real. And over time, you'll notice the spaces between your distractions grow longer. The moments of presence deepen, and what was once effort becomes ease. You begin to live not as a prisoner of thought, but as an inhabitant of the here and now. And in that space, life reveals its quiet, exquisite beauty, not in grand accomplishments or distant dreams, but in this breath, this touch, this moment. And so we begin to remember that life isn't something to chase, it's something to notice, to savor, to quietly bow to, because when we are fully here, we find what we've been searching for all along, not somewhere else, not some other time, but right here, within this fleeting, eternal now. There's a truth we all carry, though few of us speak it aloud. No matter how beautiful our days, no matter how carefully we build our lives, suffering always finds its way in. A fleeting heartbreak, an unexpected loss, a lingering emptiness heavy in the chest. It arrives unannounced, and sometimes it never fully leaves. But what if suffering isn't the enemy? What if it's the messenger? A quiet voice calling us back to a truth we've forgotten. The Buddha spoke of this over 2,500 years ago. He called it dukkha, the fundamental unsatisfactoriness woven into the fabric of human existence. It's not just the grand tragedies of life. It's the subtle ache we feel even in moments of joy, knowing that everything we hold will one day slip through our hands. You see, we don't suffer because of what happens. We suffer because of the stories we wrap around it, because we refuse to fully be here with whatever is. When grief knocks, we bolt the door. When fear rises, we drown it in distraction. When happiness appears, we grasp at it, terrified it will leave, and in clinging to it so tightly, we crush its light. Our pain isn't born from the moment itself, but from our resistance to it. The paradox is this: the harder we fight reality, the deeper we sink into suffering. And yet, when we allow ourselves to meet life as it unfolds, without labels, without judgment, a strange kind of freedom appears. Not freedom from pain, but freedom within it. Imagine standing in the middle of a storm. You can flail against the wind, curse the sky, or pretend it isn't happening. None of these will change the storm. But if you stand still, if you feel the wind on your skin, listen to the rain and witness each moment as it comes and goes, the storm transforms. It's no longer your enemy. It's simply the weather, and you are simply here. This is what it means to live fully. The masters knew that suffering isn't something to escape. It's something to understand, to turn toward with gentle, unwavering awareness. When sorrow visits, let it sit beside you. When fear whispers, listen without flinching. When loneliness wraps its arms around your chest, feel its weight, its shape, its texture. And then, like every wave in the ocean, it too will pass, because nothing is permanent, not the joy, not the grief, not even you. And in accepting this, you touch something deeper than both pleasure and pain. You touch the still, unshaken awareness beneath it all, the quiet witness, the sky that holds every weather. This isn't about becoming cold or detached or indifferent. It's about being so intimately connected to the truth of this moment, so deeply in love with life in all its forms, that even suffering becomes a sacred guest. Because the alternative, closing our hearts, numbing ourselves, living only half alive, is the real tragedy. When we stop running from the moment, we discover that beneath every experience is something precious. A lesson, a clarity, a reminder of what matters most. The pain of losing someone reminds us to cherish those still here. The sting of failure shows us where our heart truly lies. The ache of longing reveals our capacity to love, to hope, to dream. And when we live fully, when we show up for every single breath, whether it arrives sweet or bitter, we take away suffering's power to trap us. The wound may remain, but it no longer defines us. The storm may rage, but we no longer drown. Instead, we float. We feel. We live. And in that radical presence, we find a freedom no one can give us and no one can take away. The Zen masters call this the freedom of no escape. Not because you're trapped, but because you realize you don't need to run. Everything you need is here, in this breath, in this feeling, in this endlessly unfolding moment, even now, even here. And so, as we continue this journey, let's carry this knowing with us, that our suffering doesn't diminish us, it refines us, it reveals us. And when met with open awareness, it becomes the very path to peace. Because this isn't a story about escape. It's a story about belonging to life, to ourselves, to this fragile, beautiful, terrifying, sacred moment, and the next one, and the next. In a world buzzing with endless notifications, flashing screens, and constant chatter, how do we find stillness? How do we reclaim the simple art of paying attention? Everywhere we turn, distractions crowd our senses. From the moment we wake to the moment we fall asleep, our minds race, juggling emails, messages, deadlines, worries, and desires. The present slips through our fingers like grains of sand, unnoticed, uncherished. This isn't just modern chaos, it's an ancient challenge in a new disguise. The mind, by nature, seeks stimulation, always hungry, always searching. It's easy to mistake busyness for living, noise for connection, speed for progress. But what if the real progress lies in slowing down, in turning off the noise and tuning into the moment right here, right now? Mindfulness is the gentle practice of bringing our attention fully to the present moment. It's the antidote to distraction, the anchor in turbulent seas. Not a technique to fix ourselves, but a way of being, a warm embrace for the mind, body, and heart. Imagine standing by a river. The water rushes past, shimmering in the sun. You don't try to stop it or control it. You simply watch. You notice the currents, the ripples, the reflections. And in that simple act of noticing, you become grounded. In the same way, mindfulness invites us to notice our thoughts as they flow, without judgment or attachment, to feel the rise and fall of our breath, to sense the weight of our body against the chair, to listen deeply to the sounds around us. And with practice, these moments of presence grow, like tiny seeds planted in the soil of our busy lives, slowly blossoming into peace and clarity. Yet, practicing mindfulness in a distracted world is no easy feat. The mind rebels. It wanders. It pulls us back into old habits of rushing and reacting. But here's the secret. Mindfulness is not about perfection. It's about gentle return. Every time the mind drifts, every time distraction pulls you away, you bring yourself back, softly, kindly, without frustration. Each return is a victory. Each moment of awareness is a step toward freedom. And when mindfulness becomes part of daily life, magic begins to happen. You start to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. The steam rising from your morning tea, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the sound of a loved one's voice. Simple moments become portals to deep connection with yourself, with others, with life itself. This practice doesn't require hours of meditation or retreat from the world. It asks only for your willingness to show up, fully, here and now. A mindful breath between meetings, a moment of listening without planning your response, a pause before reacting to difficult emotions. Little by little, these acts weave a tapestry of presence, resilience, and joy. So, even amidst the noise and haste, mindfulness gifts us a sacred space, a refuge where life can be tasted fully, deeply, and without distraction. Because when we truly practice mindfulness, we don't just live in the moment. We become the moment. And that is the most profound freedom there is. Imagine for a moment that enlightenment, true awakening, is not something far away, distant in time or place. It is not a treasure buried beneath layers of effort, waiting for us to find it in the future. Rather, it's a miracle that unfolds within this very breath, right here, right now. Across centuries and cultures, sages have told the same story. Enlightenment is not a destination. It is the unveiling of what has always been. A radiant clarity hiding in plain sight beneath the clutter of our busy minds. And what blocks us from seeing this miracle? Our restless longing for something else. Our endless chase after what's next, success, happiness, peace. We believe that awakening will come when we have more time, when life slows down, when problems vanish. But life never slows down. Problems never fully disappear. And so, the miracle waits not on the horizon, but right inside this very moment, if only we dare to open our eyes and see. To live fully is to realize that each moment is a portal, each breath a doorway to awakening, each sensation, thought, or feeling, no matter how ordinary or painful, holds the key to freedom. Think about the last time you felt completely present, maybe watching a sunset, listening to a child's laughter, or simply breathing deeply. In those fleeting seconds, time seemed to expand, and a sense of peace washed over you. That peace is a glimpse of enlightenment. But enlightenment is not just bliss or escape from suffering. It's the profound understanding that beneath all change and turmoil lies an unshakable truth, a stillness untouched by pain, a light that never dims. This truth isn't found by running away from life. It's found by diving deeply into it, by embracing every shade of experience with open-hearted presence. The Buddha taught that the present moment is all we ever have, and that awakening is possible in this very instant. Not someday when conditions are perfect, but right now. And when we fully inhabit the present, something miraculous happens. The chains of past regrets and future anxieties dissolve. We step out of the endless cycle of craving and aversion, and we touch the radiant clarity of what simply is. This awakening transforms everything. The mundane becomes sacred. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. A simple breath becomes a gateway to infinite peace. A moment of stillness becomes a wellspring of wisdom. And you realize, enlightenment isn't a distant dream. It's a living reality, always present, always accessible. So in the midst of life's chaos, remember, you don't have to wait for a special moment to awaken. The present moment is the miracle. The present moment is enlightenment. When you lean into this truth, when you live fully here and now, you discover a freedom no one can take away. A freedom that shines from within, lighting the path forward with gentle, unwavering clarity. And so, as we step toward the final part of this journey, carry this miracle with you, this endless, radiant present, because this moment right now is everything. As we reach the close of this journey through presence, mindfulness, and awakening, one truth remains clear. Living fully is not a destination, but a sacred commitment, a vow to show up, to breathe deeply, to embrace each moment with open heart and unwavering courage. This vow is not about perfection. It is about sincerity. The sincerity to live with awareness, to meet life as it is, both its beauty and its challenges. Because life, in all its mystery, invites us to dance fully, to experience joy and sorrow, love and loss, light and shadow with equal grace. And here's the wondrous secret. The moment you make this vow, your journey truly begins. Every breath is a fresh beginning. Every step is an invitation to live deeper, wiser, and more freely. You are not alone on this path. Countless seekers walk alongside you, each with their own struggles and breakthroughs, each discovering the miracle of presence in their own unique way. So take this moment now to breathe in fully. Feel the aliveness within you, and step forward with intention. If this journey has touched something inside you, if these words have sparked a flame of curiosity or peace, I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to the channel. Join the community of fellow travelers seeking wisdom and presence. And share your own story in the comments below. Your voice matters. Your presence enriches us all. Remember, living fully is a lifelong adventure. The journey begins anew with every breath you take. So here's to living deeply, right here, right now. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing presence.